And Seneca has a whole letter where he's like, okay, so this is a common Stoic doctrine, but I think this is crazy. And here's why. Here's my arguments for it. So I think we've got good models for Stoics that say, yeah, I don't think you have to buy everything that our predecessors said.
Welcome to Stoa Conversations. In this podcast, Caleb Ontiveros and I discuss the theory and practice of Stoicism. Each week we'll share two conversations, one between the two of us, and the other will be an in-depth conversation with an expert. In this episode of Stoa Conversations, I talk with Gregory Sadler about common criticisms of Stoicism by other philosophers. It's a really eclectic episode where we look at how Stoicism has been received and treated by different thinkers throughout history, both ancient thinkers like Aristotelians or Epicureans, but also early modern thinkers and modern thinkers such as Hegel, Nietzsche, and the Neo-Aristotelian movement. Gregory Sadler is the founder and president of Reason.io, a company dedicated to making resources of contemporary and classical philosophy available and accessible to non-philosophers. He has an MA and PhD in philosophy and held a tenure-track position before deciding to leave academia to focus on public philosophy. I first encountered Greg through his popular YouTube channel, which has hundreds of videos breaking down the thinking of philosophers ranging from Epictetus and Seneca to Hegel and Hume. Greg really is one of those people who has an incredible breadth in his understanding of philosophy, and I think that comes off in this episode where instead of just focusing on ancient philosophy, Greg's able to show how Stoicism has interacted with and been received by philosophers throughout a broad history of time. So I think this will be a fun episode for anybody looking to see Stoicism in that broader philosophical context. I hope you enjoy. Okay. Hi, Greg. How you doing?
I'm doing good. And you?
No, doing great. Excited to chat with you. Really looking forward to this conversation. So for those listening who might not be familiar with you and your background, I was hoping you could kick things off. Tell us a bit about how you got into Stoicism, kind of your journey into the Stoic community.
Yeah, so I got exposed to a bit of Stoicism back when I was a college student about half of my lifetime ago, but it didn't really stick. And I don't think I was in a proper frame of mind to really appreciate what was going on. We read the Enchiridion because we did an ancient philosophy class. And that was basically all that my professors presented. And it was kind of like, Plato, Aristotle, those are the real show. Now we're going to do this Hellenistic stuff because we have to cover it. And then we'll get past that and get on to cool stuff instead. So they weren't very receptive to it. I did like, some of the ideas, but I think I had a hard time wrapping my head around quite a few of the things that were being said. And it might have been because of the translations. And then I read Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. I picked it up at a used bookstore. And I really liked some of it. And then like the virtues talk kind of went over my head. And I think there's a lot of things that I just didn't have anyone who could explain it to me. And I didn't have the background to appreciate it well. And then I just dropped it for a while. And when I was in graduate school, I happened to pick up Epictetus's discourses. And I was very interested in not issues so much of free will and determinism, but like more about the mechanics. How does the will actually work? How do we form habits? How do we, move ourselves either towards the good or away from it, become better or worse people? How do we develop self-control? And I started reading it, and I was actually in a bookstore reading it, and I was like, holy crap, this is really interesting stuff. Because I'd been exposed to, Platonic and Aristotelian, let's call it philosophical anthropology and psychology and some other stuff. And I didn't know that the Stoics had this sort of approach. And then I started reading more. I was very interested in philosophical theories that pertain to anger and anger management. And I found that the Stoics had a lot of really cool resources for that, including a whole book by Seneca on anger, but, good stuff in Marcus and Epictetus and Seneca's other works. And so I just started, I started studying. And I think the thing that actually like drew me into the community was before modern Stoicism became the modern Stoicism organization, they were kind of a loose association. There was a blog, Stoicism Today. There was a Stoic Week class that started in 2012, and I started participating in that. And that's how I got to know people. And then I got invited to become the editor of Stoicism Today in 2016. Patrick Usher, the original editor, stepped down, and that effectively like made me part of the organization. And you get invited to give talks and things like that. And so it just kept growing and growing and growing. There wasn't any real plan to it on my part. But I will say this: I don't identify as a Stoic in the sense of like that's my main or only thing. I'm an eclectic, where I'll take things from the Aristotelians or the Platonists or the Stoics that I find useful. Very much like Cicero. Cicero is a eclectic of that sort. But I think there's a lot that Stoicism has to offer, and then there's areas where it's superior to other approaches, right? But then there's also, some of the criticisms that we're going to discuss. I think some of them aren't actually on point, like Cicero, who says that you Stoics, you got great philosophy, but you're not terrible at rhetoric. You just won't do it. And so you're missing all these great opportunities to get your message out there. Why don't you be more like those Aristotelians who, they don't have to dilute their philosophy by bringing rhetoric in. I think some of those things can be kind of on point.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting to me that you described yourself as an eclectic, because I was trying to think of the right word for it. When I think of you as a philosopher, I think of you as somebody who has such a great functional grasp of so much of the history of philosophy. And as you alluded to, what we're going to talk about some criticisms of Stoicism, but I'm interested in your take, since you're as an eclectic, but you're particularly involved in the modern Stoic community. What do you think are some of the things that Stoicism gets right or does well, or what it attracts you in particular to that part of philosophy's history?
Yeah, I won't say that the Stoic theory of emotions is completely correct, but it's certainly more robust and developed than their predecessors. And I think with Stoicism, we also get, let's call them emphases on particular ideas or practices that actually then benefited other schools. Because if you look at, for example, Alexander of Aphrodisias, who's a Aristotelian, he's read the Stoics and he'll engage them, or Plutarch, a little bit later on, if I remember right. He's a Platonist, but he heavily engages the Stoics. And so it's sort of like that proverb, iron sharpens iron, right? If you got good stuff over here with the Stoics, then others, by arguing against them or appropriating some of their stuff, it can be quite good. The emphasis on what we actually do, however you want to translate, what's up to us, what we can control, what's in our power, what's our business. That, officially Epictetus is the person formulating that, although it's an Aristotelian concept originally. But, you see that in Cicero and Seneca, having a lot of focus on that, and then like exploring, well, how are things actually in our control, or things that seem to be external and indifference, how can we make use of them properly? They're really powerful. And this is the stuff that we still have. I mean, if we uncovered some treasure trove of lost Stoic texts, because we've lost, probably 90% of what these people wrote, who knows what cool stuff we'd find in there,
Yeah, I think that's that point about emphasis. That's one that I think about a lot, which is this idea of there's so much philosophy, there's so much to talk about and focus on, and there's this kind of question of where you draw your attention, where do you emphasize, which is a similar point to the point Epictetus is making, right? Which is, when you're navigating the world, where's your attention? Where's your emphasis? Is it on what's up to you or on what's not up to you?
Yeah, and there's another sense to that too. A lot of times in the history of ideas, we're like super interested in, well, who did something first, right?
Yeah.
That's not really that important. It really is about who's really doing something with it, who's doing something with an idea in a robust way, unpacking it, tying it together with practices that we could incorporate into our lives. So maybe, I just kind of stumbled across the word, but maybe emphasis is something that we should be looking to more often than like who originated something.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think that's something to be said. I mean, I want to get into our topic of, of criticisms, but I'm enjoying this. I, I think that's something to be said about the way that scholarship is done, right? So scholarship is a lot about providing credit. So like in academia, it's a lot about, well, you got to give credit, you got to cite, you have to
Yeah,
source.
yeah.
And so then when you look at the text, you're like, well, who is Epictetus drawing from? Who is he
Oh,
citing? Or
yeah.
what are the sources here? And you end up through that perspective instead of, as you said, which I think the Stoics are more focused on, well, okay, what's the way to package this, to present this, or what's the way to actualize these teachings,
Yeah, that's a whole can of worms with Epictetus, right? Because, and in two major ways. One is that the only reference that he has to Aristotelians is a negative one, where they're not as bad as Epicureans, but they're still like on that continuum. you know? And yet he is the only Stoic who makes something out of this originally Aristotelian concept, whatever you want to call it, of proiresis, right? I mean, it's not that people don't use that term before. You can find it in Plato, you can find it in some of the rhetors, but Aristotle turns it into a faculty. And it's not quite as robust in Aristotle as it is in Epictetus. And you're like, well, where the hell did this come from? I
Yeah,
mean, we know that the Stoics do talk about proiresis, but they don't care much about it. It's just one kind of horme or impulse. So there's that going on. And the up to us thing, that's in Aristotle too. So you're like, well, what's going on there? Does he know Aristotle? Does he not know Aristotle? We don't know. I mean, the best thing is to be kind of agnostic about that.
hmm
And then, he'll reference Stoic philosophers, particularly Chrysippus. So we know that he's read these guys, but he doesn't often cite them. And he's kind of disparaging about it. He'll be like, you can read Chrysippus. That's awesome if you can do that. But that's mainly because Chrysippus is hard to read. It's better that you actually understand what we're talking about and carry out the practices. So, I think he can afford to get away with that because he has studied this stuff so much. He can be kind of flip towards it.
totally. At the risk of, if we keep going, I will pull this into a conversation about Epictetus for the whole time, and so I have to stop myself. One of the things we wanted to talk about, so building on that theme of who's influencing who, that relationship between thinkers.
Yeah.
One of the things that we thought would be fun to do in this conversation is talk about some criticisms of Stoicism, both by their contemporaries and then also of later thinkers, but people we might still think of being historical, like Nietzsche and Hegel. And I think, first I want to say, I think this is a great topic because, as you said, iron sharpens iron, just using that metaphor, it really helps you understand what Stoicism is when you see other people bump up against it or other ways of thinking
Right.
bump up against it. And second, I know for myself, I'm just excited to learn from you and talk about this because I'm really focused in this kind of ancient area. So to talk about what people like Hegel think or someone like William James, that's going to be a different experience for me. So to jump into it, we wanted to talk about what did Hegel think about the Stoics and kind of what was, I mean, maybe at first of all, a little bit, who was Hegel? Why should
Okay.
we care what he thinks about the Stoics? And then what does he have to say about Stoicism?
All right. So Hegel we're talking about Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. He's a major German philosopher in the early part of the 19th century. And he's called a German idealist, and it's a very loose movement that includes people who hate Hegel's guts, like Arthur Schopenhauer, who has some horribly unfair criticisms of Hegel. It includes a whole bunch of other people. And Immanuel Kant is, in large respect, the person who kicks this movement off in the late 18th century. And, Hegel's an interesting thinker in his own right. I do a lot of work on him, but I also find him pretty frustrating to read. a good bit of the time because he's not a particularly good writer. So you have to really, some of the times that you have to work, it's because the ideas are really complex, and sometimes he just doesn't express those ideas well. And he's a creature of his time in many respects. So that like the criticisms of Stoicism, he makes similar criticisms of Hellenistic philosophy in general. And so to back up a little bit, up into the 19th century, you do see a lot of big name philosophers thinking that not just the Stoics, but also the skeptics and the Epicureans are really well worth engaging with. And also philosophers like Cicero. So if you look at David Hume, who's not that distant in time, he actually has essays, and the essays are on what he considers to be important philosophical points of view. One is the Platonist. Okay, Plato's always a big name, right? There's no the Aristotelian, because that's considered just kind of moribund stuff, associated with the scholastics. And then the others are the Stoic, the skeptic, and the Epicurean. So there's a lot of people from the Renaissance onward to, if we want to be very arbitrary and probably wrong about this, let's say, 1800, right? Who are, they may be criticizing these people, but they're taking them seriously as philosophers. And then in the early 1800s, particularly in Germany, there's this set of ideas that all get kind of glommed together. And one of them is that Plato and Aristotle are the real ancient philosophers who offer us something important to grapple with, right? Something with metaphysical depth, something with real ethical and epistemological interest. And then the stuff that comes after them, that's not very interesting until we get to Plotinus. And then once again, we've got great metaphysics going on. And then Christianity comes around. You've got Augustine and people like that. And, sometimes you look at that and you're like, well, how the hell did they come up with that idea? So part of it is tied in, especially for Hegel, with the notion that in the ancient Greek city-state, people could develop themselves more than they could in the ways of organizing things that followed. So like, Philip conquers Greece essentially. And, as a side note too, everyone, people who are Spartan fanciers are always like, well, he didn't conquer Sparta. He could have. He just didn't consider it worth his time, and he wasn't going to bother with them. They were, like a hillbilly backwater by that time of Greece, and had been beaten many times by the, like the Thebans and people like that. So, Alexander inherits that, founds this gigantic empire, which then after he dies, breaks apart into, larger units. And the idea was that you, as a human being, you have the greatest potential for development in a small community where you can like see everybody and, engage in politics. And that's always been a silly like idealization. It usually didn't work that way. Elites ran just about all of these cities. It wasn't quite so egalitarian as that. But this is the idea that Hegel and other people have. So all these Hellenistic philosophies become reinterpreted as escapes from the crappy situation that you now inhabit. So that goes along with this, Aristotle, Plato, they were able to do the real philosophy. These other guys, it's kind of like second rate. And, Hegel also says, so he adds one other thing to the mix, and this is in his lectures on the history of philosophy. He says that we moderns, we can't like take on these sorts of things anymore. We can't pretend to be Stoics or even Aristotelians, We're in a new configuration. It's silly to pretend that you could possibly live like a Stoic or an Epicurean or a skeptic. You gotta, he's not saying throw it all out. You still study it, but it's just not a viable possibility. If you were to bring him in today and show him the modern Stoic movement that's developed with, I don't even know how many people. I would say there's probably at least 1 million people worldwide who are doing something, right? He might have to revise his views, or he might be dogmatic and just say, no, none of that counts.
And
They're all just deluding themselves.
As someone who's very biased the other way, what was the perspective on why it's not viable?
It's he just thinks that human consciousness, and not just individual consciousness, but in societies, has developed so far beyond that it would just be kind of silly. It'd be sort of like saying, and again, if we think about the examples that could come to mind, like think about how we do sports today. We have really nice equipment that tends to be lighter and stronger and all that. But if you wanted to like ski with old skis that people might have used back, 2000 years ago, I don't know when skis were invented, but I'm sure it's been a long time. I mean, you could do it, right? It'd be more difficult, but you could do it and you might even get good at it. He's got this kind of, typical modern mentality of we are so much further advanced and our societies are and our technology and all that, that you're deluding yourself if you want to go back to an earlier form of social organization and philosophy, what he would call a shape of consciousness. A gestalt is the term that he uses for shape. So, when you look at that, a lot of people bought into that. And it wasn't just Hegel who was saying that. It was, people who were doing ancient scholarship. And it becomes kind of an unquestioned prejudice that I think goes all the way through into the 20th century. That's why figures like Anthony Long and particularly in respect to Stoicism, Lawrence Becker are so important for academic understanding of these things because they don't buy into that prejudice. And it's the sort of thing where, like, if you've been told don't bother with these people over here, you're not going to bother with those people over there. You're going to trust what the experts or your professors say. And if you do spend time with them, you'll be like, oh, I'm slumming with these second-rate philosophers. Maybe there's something interesting in them. But if you actually look carefully at what the texts have, there's really cool stuff. Same thing you could say with Plutarch, a Platonist. He got dismissed. He's just second-rate. But I mean, his stuff is amazing, So, so that's part of what's driving the story with Hegel. And then there's one other element, Hegel he's got a whole section of the phenomenology of spirit, which is entitled Stoicism. But what he means by Stoicism is this retreat within, And now think about the trope of the retreat, right? Marcus actually uses that. You've got an inner citadel, right? An acropolis within you. You can take a retreat anytime that you want, but you don't do it to hide from the world. You do it so you can go back out and re-engage the world. Hegel interprets Stoicism as this kind of sour grapes, reality sucks. I'm just going to withdraw into myself where I can find the true, the good, the rational, not like this screwy world out here. And, when you compare that to what Stoics actually say in their texts, you're like, how did this guy arrive at this conclusion? Well, he started out with this notion that the end of the Greek city-state was the end of an important way of forming people, So his criticisms are generally not on point, but they are on point, I guess you could say, for how we contrast uppercase S Stoicism and lowercase s Stoicism. They're right about the lowercase s stuff. But I actually think that people like Hegel, as well as others in the 19th century, they're the ones that are actually responsible for there being a lowercase s Stoicism. All this talk about, Stoicism is just stiff upper lip and, figure out what matters and the things that don't matter at all, withdraw within yourself. I think that they're the ones who created within the intellectual culture a caricature of Stoicism that a lot of people have bought into down to the present.
Yeah. So maybe a good criticism of a misinterpretation, a good criticism of a different philosophy, which is the small s Stoicism. The other thing I was thinking there, I loved your ski metaphor, even if you just made it up, I still really liked it.
It might be totally historically inaccurate.
But I do have a kind of respect for people who meet even if they're rejecting Stoic as a bad pair of skis, Hegel's still skiing, I guess, right? Like he's still taking
Yeah.
philosophy seriously and just saying they're just not succeeding. I sometimes get frustrated with if you look at Stoicism or philosophy as a kind of historical artifact and you're like, wow, I can't criticize it. It's because it's like crystallized, it's
Mm.
pristine. I can't
Yeah,
wrestle with
yeah.
it. So I have a respect for people that take Stoicism seriously enough to have problems with it if they think it's wrong. Obviously, it's too bad if you're misinterpreting it in this kind of rejection of life.
It's a good way to put it. That's another way you could frame it and that's a good one we'll lead in with Nietzsche, right? Rejection of life, rejection of like the richness of our lives.
Well, that's what I was going to say. I wanted to jump over to some Nietzsche because that's the way I understand his criticism of Stoicism was kind of
Yeah.
being very similar to the way you were presenting Hegel there, which is you retreating to the inner citadel. You're not confronting the world, I guess, bravely. You're actually being maybe kind of cowardly in this rejection of the world as it is. And then Nietzsche has these things about, ironically, you call that living in accordance with nature, but you come, about maybe as far from it as possible.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
he's got kind of, so if we only look at that one long passage that tends to be the one that everybody brings up, right? There's a lot of moving parts there. And then when we look at the other things that he says about Stoicism, he talks about it in several different books, but I think that, if we stick with just beyond good and evil, right? At one point, he says, we Stoics. So clearly he's not rejecting them entirely out of hand. And you got to say, well, what is it what's the beef he has with them? And there is the like life denying thing, for Nietzsche. He says you're tyrannizing over nature. You're making nature look like you, rational, which, Stoicism does. The logos runs through everything. We can actually understand nature, be part of it. And he's like, nah, you're just projecting that onto this messy thing that we actually call nature. And I don't know, maybe there's some parts of that are actually right when you see Stoic arguments for how everything works out nicely and fits together nicely. I kind of think some of us are like, I don't think that's quite true. It's got to be more complicated. But really, what's happening here is Nietzsche. You could reframe it as Nietzsche saying, "I've got a different conception of nature than you do, so I don't like your conception of nature, and yours should be more like mine." Now that's not a good criticism at all. And so people who bring that up, they there's a lot of people who seem to think that if you can criticize something, it must be wrong, right? Or some famous person has had something to say about it. But what if the famous person's wrong? You got to actually go further with that. And then the other thing that he says that I think he's actually more positive about, talking about tyrannizing over nature. Well, that's what Nietzsche thinks we have to do with ourselves, because we are complicated, composite things. So the will to power within our body, or our spirit, which is something that comes out of body, is the best part of ourself, or sometimes the worst part of ourself, running the show, right? And then we do this in families and societies. This self-tyrannizing, Nietzsche thinks, is something that allowed us to develop as a species. So he's not saying that it's always a bad or cowardly thing. It might actually be necessary for producing a certain kind of human being.
So one thing here is this idea that tyranny is maybe not as bad as, we have to be careful. When we hear tyranny, we think, wow, this is terrible. But when Nietzsche's
Yeah.
using it, maybe he has some respect for tyrants in a sense. And so I suppose what would then, I was understanding you to say that Nietzsche's maybe more sympathetic to the Stoics than we would think. What does a kind of sympathy, maybe what does that look like? What does a sympathetic Nietzschean reading of Stoicism look like?
Yeah. Well, it would have to throw out some things that traditional Stoicism thinks are absolutely central, like, the notion of the universe itself being, I mean, it's the pantheism to begin with, the universe being
Mhm.
one vast organized cosmos, but even having logos running through all of it, or providence, right? The Stoic commitment, which is not a purely Stoic commitment. I mean, Christians, Jews have this as well. The Platonists, in a certain sense, might buy into this, that things are arranged well. I mean, Nietzsche doesn't. If you were gonna try to fuse Nietzscheanism and Stoicism, that would be one you'd have to get rid of. I guess you could also say that Nietzsche would look at the Stoics less as like guides for us, providing us with the overall, like well worked out philosophical structure, and he'd be more interested in experimenting. But I mean, that's not missing in Stoicism. Epictetus is quite often willing to say to people who are not buying into his stuff, he'll say, well, you go and try it your way. And then after you screw it up, let's have a chat. like, for example, the guy doesn't want to study logic. He's like, I just need to do exercises. And I said, well, okay. How do you know you have to do exercises? Did somebody convince you of that, right? Maybe you should be using a little bit of logic there, right? So I don't know. I think Nietzsche probably would be more interested in us just, doing bold experiments, but there's no reason why we couldn't. Let's use that term again. He says, you Stoics, you self-tyrannize. Well, that's part of what a Nietzschean strong person, or, if there is such a thing as the Ubermensch, that's part of what they do is rule themselves cruelly, you know? So I think he'd be cool with that.
You just have to do it in a kind of a punk way, maybe a bit more of a cynic way.
I should say the whole notion of being like pro-social, Nietzsche wouldn't buy that, right?
Yeah.
Because that's more like what he calls herd mentality or herd morality. But Nietzsche doesn't want you to be this. You've got all these book covers with the wanderer, and you see the guy standing on the mountain looking at the clouds and stuff like that. That's a failed Nietzschean. I mean, and Nietzsche's life was not all that happy either, in part due to illness. But Nietzsche thinks that it's nice to have solitude, Einsamkeit, right, to be by yourself, but you should ultimately have friendships. You should have relationships with other people, just not with those, scummy plebe herd people, But, you can find other people of who are into the things that you're into. And I think, the Stoics really appreciate relationships and friendship.
Yeah, I mean, I like that. I think also, I think what we're getting here, what I'm connecting between these two examples, the Hegel and the Nietzsche, is this tendency of we have to put things in boxes. And, maybe Hegel's making a mistake when he puts Stoicism in a box, and maybe we're making a mistake when we take Nietzsche's criticism of Stoicism in a box. And this ability to kind of embrace the ambiguity or a little bit more broadness here. I
think that's right. Yeah.
Maybe not as immediately satisfying, but probably a bit more accurate too.
And if we value truth, right? So, and again, not a purely Stoic thing, but the Stoics place a really high premium on being in touch with reality, seeing things the way they are, not misrepresenting things. Then, when we're looking at philosophers, we don't want to have crappy pop culture, misses the point kind of glosses on them. We want to actually read the text and see what it says.
Mm-hmm. And so moving to another thinker, who's William James, and what does he have to say about Stoicism?
Well, he is an interesting guy. We typically call him a pragmatist. And we often, when in philosophy, we forget that he actually held a position in psychology. He straddles both fields, and he's not the guy who coined the term pragmatism. There's like this story. Do you know this story about? So Charles Sanders Peirce is prior to him, and he's he's a bit more eccentric than James in some ways, and he produces something that he calls pragmatism. And James kind of copies it, but only certain parts that he likes from Peirce. And then he says, I'm doing pragmatism too. And Peirce then doesn't like what James is doing. And he changes the name of his doctrine to pragmaticism and says, it's such an ugly word, nobody will steal it from me, right? But they're not totally distant from each other. And some of this might have been more about personalities. So James is a huge advocate of adopting this pragmatic method, which, sometimes people say, oh, it's, whatever works is true. It's not quite so simple as that. But there's a really heavy emphasis on trying to verify things, thinking about what kind of experiments we could set up, thinking about what the cash value of an idea is, to use one of James's famous phrases. And in the varieties of religious experience, he talks about Marcus Aurelius. He doesn't talk so much about Epictetus or Seneca, but he wants to think about the worldview, the way of orienting yourself in the world that different points of view offer. And they could be religious. And he takes Marcus as being a religious thinker, which I think he is, right? He thinks there's a God. He thinks that God does things in the universe. He's not a big prayer guy, but, there's neither is Epictetus, who's even more religious, at least in his expressions, than Marcus Aurelius. And James, he's a very nuanced observer. And these are actually the Gifford lectures, which for a philosopher is sort of like the pinnacle. If you get to give the Gifford lectures, you've really made it. So he's giving these Gifford lectures on what we can learn without buying into somebody else's religious beliefs and practices, what we can learn by looking at what they say and what they do and how things work. And so he's got some pretty sympathetic things to say in parts about Marcus early on in the text. But he also, and I think he's right about this. He also wants to contrast the Stoic point of view against like a committed Christian point, where, the Stoic thinks that things are largely fated, and there's no point in praying to God. I mean, if you want to pray, like you could express gratitude, but you're not going to engage in what we nowadays in philosophy of religion call petitionary prayer, right? Because it's not going to, if it's the right thing to do, God's already doing it. You don't need to remind him or her, or whatever, probably it is better. God's already got that handled, And so he thinks that Marcus is a bit gloomy, which might be right, I mean, when I read other parts of Marcus, he seems like he does have a lot of joy in his life. He can take pleasure. I mean, the guy can take pleasure in looking at the cracks on bread. So clearly he's not wandering around, with his head down, oh, woe is me, or something like that, right? And he had a rough life, right? I mean, he went through an awful lot. So James is kind of an interesting guy. And you could say, if you think about the culture that James is in here in the States, people read Marcus Aurelius or read Seneca or read Epictetus, but what did they actually take from it? There's this kind of, let's call it not fully intellectual culture, but we had some brushes with stuff. I think a lot of, sort of like me when I was a college student, you could pick up the Meditations and be like, oh yeah, I like this toughness stuff and not letting things get to me. But this virtue stuff, that's not so, that's too preachy, churchy kind of things. And, I'm not into temperance. I want to drink as much as I can. I'm a college student, And so I think James is part of this, whether he likes it or not, this cultural movement that produces the lowercase s Stoicism as an ideal, as the sort of thing that many people have in their mind when they see the word Stoic. I don't think he intended that, but I think that was part of the effect of his writings.
And so if Marcus Aurelius is, I guess, is too gloomy, what's kind of the alternative here? What is William James arguing for?
Oh, he's not really arguing for. In the varieties of religious experience, he's looking at sort of like a panorama of different religious peoples reporting about their experiences and their mindsets and all of that. I don't think that James wants us to jump in, with some sort of like leap of faith and take on a more optimistic religious attitude. He's just sort of remarking that this is the case, that this is about as far as a Stoic can go,
Yeah, so more of a kind of a descriptive project.
There
And
you go.
then,
Yeah.
yeah, and then being like, well, that's too bad. If that's as far as the Stoic can get,
I,
maybe
I
it's,
will say too, James himself could be quite pessimistic at times. We're getting a little bit into the weeds with this, but it could be kind of good to bring it up. He
Mhm.
contrasts what he calls the tough-minded and the tender-minded and their attitudes towards life. And the tough-minded are the people who are less in touch with reality than the tender-minded. And the tender-minded, things get to them more, right? But it's also because they see how things suck, when they do. Whereas the tough-minded, they're just, kind of whistling, going along, everything's great. I mean, the limit case would be this cartoon character, Mr. Magoo. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but there used to be this cartoon guy who was like totally oblivious to his environment, and like he'd always cause accidents for other people, and he's just going along having a great time. James was himself tender-minded. And I actually, now we're going to go further into the weeds. I was in a faculty fellowship one summer with Alistair McIntyre, and he was leading it, and there were 12 of us faculty members in it. And this topic came up about, depression in the contemporary sense. Are you better off not being depressed at all, or maybe being depressed a little bit as a rational response to the reality that we encounter, and it also helps you to see things more. And McIntyre, who himself he told us in the session, he's struggled with depression. He brought up William James, and he said, I kind of think, and I don't have proof for this, that being mildly depressed would actually be an advantage for grasping reality, as opposed to not having anything like that going on, because you're attuned to things. You actually, your response is because you actually do see the things that don't hold together or get in each other's way or kind of suck. We don't have to be Pollyannish about that. And I think that's right myself. And I go by my own experience with depression. You have to be very careful not to impose like a depressive mentality on things and be a downer. But, you know, if you look at the world that we exist in, there's a lot of challenges and stuff like that. And so we might actually be doing ourselves a disservice by trying to get rid of all of our negative emotions or all of our negative responses, which I suppose you could say could be a criticism of the Stoics, right? If the goal is to get rid of all anxiety, which you wouldn't though, because there's still like rational fear, right?
Mhm.
Caution, eulabia, but get rid of all of the what we call the negative emotions. Well, maybe you would be cutting yourself off from some things that are important. And you notice that some of the Stoics actually do consider that. Like officially, grief is a bad emotion. But Seneca is willing to say, I'm not going to advise you to grieve, but I'm also not going to say don't grieve at all. Just, don't be like doing the kind of crazy stuff that people do, like jumping on the coffin as it's going into the ground, or, you know, crying for 3 days straight or stuff like that.
Mhm.
Maybe there's something that provides us with that we need. Like, so circling back to James, right? James, I think, he would be okay with people being Stoics, but he would say you have to approach this experimentally, which I think is a good idea, you know, rather than dogmatically saying, well, if it's in the book and it's not working for me, I must be the one at fault.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much interesting things there. I don't want to lose this thought I had. One is that I never heard of the tender mind, or tough minded, but that's really nice. And I think maybe Stoicism is a way for tender minded people to try to become tough minded, or at least it
Yeah,
attracts
yeah.
tender minded people, because you wouldn't be going to Stoicism unless you were in a position where you were like, I'm feeling a lot and I need some help with how I'm
Yeah,
feeling, at
yeah.
least not today. The second thing is I value this eclecticism that you have that I don't see as much today. And I love that idea of, practice it experimentally. And if it's not working for you, don't point yourself as the problem. And I like that idea of, we can have something to learn from this, but I'm not going to be reverential towards a certain book or a system. I'm going to kind of have my own participation in that. And
Yeah.
that's a lot of what I'm hearing from this. And I guess that makes sense with the pragmatics of it, right?
And I mean, that's there in Seneca, though, right? He says, I want to say it's in letter 33, we don't have kings as Stoics. We all have to, interpret it in our own way. And you see examples of this. I want to say it's letter 120 or 121, where the Stoics had this doctrine that I guess was pretty common among them, because Aristotemus also reports it as well, that the virtues were individually living things within the living thing that is our soul. So think of them sort of like almost like the mitochondria in our cells, or I mean, it's hard to figure out what the hell they meant by this. And Seneca has a whole letter where he's like, okay, so this is a common Stoic doctrine, but I think this is crazy. And here's why. Here's my arguments for it, So I think we've got good models for Stoics that say, yeah, I don't think you have to buy everything that our predecessors said. We also know about disputes between them. Cicero reports some of these, for example, in On Duties, where like the different scholarchs argued with each other, sometimes in ways that seem kind of shifty.
Do you have an example of particularly shifty?
Yeah. So this is one I actually use in business ethics. Diogenes seemed to be the shifty guy, Diogenes of Babylon. So this is kind of a sort of like a test case or a moral dilemma that would come up. So imagine that there's a pretty isolated city and it's on the coast and there's a famine going on. There's a lack of grain, right? And this guy's got a ship and it's totally full of grain, and he's pulling into the harbor, and he knows that there's like a whole fleet of other ships behind him, like a day or two out, and they also have grain. So he's got the market cornered for the time being. Now, does he have a duty to inform the other people in the harbor that he's not the only ship with grain? Because if he informs them, then they're not going to pay like, super high prices where he could make a fortune. But it seems like it's the right thing to do, to report, right? To say, oh, all is not lost. And then, to take a decent price, but not, like scarcity level prices. So Diogenes said, no, I just need duty to do that, and this is the scholarch of the Stoic school, right? He's like, it's fine, And then I think it's Antipater came after him and he's like, this is reprehensible. You cannot do that to people. You owe them the actual truth about this sort of thing. What are you trying to do? Just make a buck off of them? I mean, I'm very roughly paraphrasing here, right? I'm adding some stuff in, but so it shows that there's like some serious debates and discussions between these people who are leading the school about precisely what the Stoic doctrine is,
Yeah, and I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, even in the modern Stoicism movement, as we continue, or as that movement continues to evolve and change and wrestle with the application of Stoicism to contemporary life. It's not, this thing has some stretch in it, right? It has some, especially when you get into particular cases like
oh yeah,
selling your grain out of your boat, as we all have had happen to us once or twice.
Selling things out of the trunk of our car.
Yeah, that's more realistic. Not letting other there's more cars coming, but you don't have to tell them. The other thing I wanted to hit on, follow up on the William James discussion, was this experience working with MacIntyre, or this one thing I want to talk about was this also Neo-Aristotelian discussion of Stoicism, criticisms in that area, maybe what they get right or wrong in your view.
Yeah, and MacIntyre is an interesting guy for that, because if you read After Virtue, which is a great book, he gets the Stoics wrong. He essentially says that they're like proto-Kantians, and he's pretty dismissive of their point of view. And Anthony Long wrote a really wonderful piece, and this is, probably three decades ago. And I don't remember the name of it offhand, but if you type in MacIntyre, Anthony Long, Stoicism, it'll pop up immediately in Google. It's got a long title to it. And essentially Long's position was, okay, you're doing great with like explaining all of these things, but you got Stoicism wrong. Here's how you actually got it wrong. And as the kind of Neo-Aristotelian that you are, this person committed to traditions and looking for correction, I'm sure you're going to welcome this, right? And McIntyre did. And actually, that's not the only thing he's been criticized for. There was an entire book about how he got Kierkegaard wrong, with all these Kierkegaard scholars weighing in. I presented a thing about how he got Anselm wrong and missed the boat on that. But coming back to Long, the other thing that Long says that's really, really interesting, he says, okay, now there's my negative criticism of you. You got this wrong, this wrong, this wrong. Now, let's think about what you are putting forward as something we should be striving for, something that we want to say is positive. You've got this notion of a tradition constituted rationality, meaning that we learn by being part of a tradition that we join and then participate within. And it's not like we can just read all the books from the outside and jump in. We have to actually be doing it, to be engaged in the community. What you're talking about as Aristotelian applies just as well to the modern Stoicism community. They're doing exactly what you're saying is great about the Aristotelians. So what that means is you have a rival virtue ethics tradition that should be in communication with the Aristotelian tradition, and you can build off of each other. And I would even go so far as to say that we can also say this about the Platonist tradition, the other really massive virtue ethics tradition in antiquity. They have some stuff to offer as well. And there are people out there it's not as big as, the more academic Aristotelian community or the Stoic community, but there's people out there who are doing group work as Platonists. They get together, every once in a while and contemplate the good and stuff like that. And so, we want to, instead of saying, we put up our walls here, here's where, Aristotelianism ends, and then, that nasty Stoicism begins over here. We should think of it more like things interpenetrating each other, which is the way it was in ancient world for the most part. There were many people who were, if not eclectics, they belonged to a school, but they'd be like, oh yeah, those Platonists, they got something right over there. Let's take it,
Yeah, well, that brings us almost full circle, right? Because when we started, we had this conception of iron sharpens iron. What's something that Stoicism is really cool? Well, it's cool because it built up, it strengthened these other philosophies. These other philosophies strengthened them as this really important part of this conversation and this development of philosophy. So I want to ask you, put you on the spot, what are some things that we could learn from Platonists or Aristotelians, especially for those listening who maybe, only are exposed to Stoicism? But before you answer that, I did some internet fact checking. Well, it's Greek ethics after McIntyre and the Stoic community of reason.
Oh.
That's the paper you're talking about, 1983, which is cool.
Yeah.
So I'll have to give that one a read after.
Yeah. So that's 40 years ago.
Yeah.
Right. That's been out. I mean, that should be required reading for everybody. I think it's
cool.
Such a good paper. Now, well, I think so. For one thing, Plato is just the beginning point of the Platonic tradition, right? There's all these great Platonist authors that we can read. In fact, one of them wrote a really cool commentary on Epictetus's Enchiridion Simplicius, well worth checking out. And what you see with these traditions is, okay, so they've got a founder and the literature of the founder, but then they continue to develop stuff along the way, and they might be developing it in relation to the Stoic. So when somebody like Plutarch comes along and says, I'm going to write a whole book about how the Stoic conception of general conceptions or preconceptions prolepses, it's got problems with it. I think Stoics ought, instead of saying, well, he's not a Stoic, I'm not going to look at that guy, they should look at it and say, okay, maybe this teaches us something. Or, if you think about the way in which we understand the emotions, maybe the Stoics can learn some things from the Aristotelians or the Platonists, or even other traditions as well, about how to understand and then deal with anxiety or anger or sadness. You can bring things in together, which again is sort of a good practice. Even the Epicureans have things to offer, as Seneca has pointed out. One of the things that is kind of cool that's still happening today in Neo-Epicurean communities is this monthly get together. I mean, ostensibly, it's to like celebrate Epicurus's birthday, right? But it's basically a communal meal that people have together in order to promote friendship. Stoics could be doing that too. And in fact, many people do, although they don't usually have a communal meal. And you can say, well, what does having a meal bring to the table? Pun intended, I guess. Well, when people eat together, they share more and they bond more. And wouldn't that be a great expression of, the pro-social side of our rationality? I mean, so we could go on and on and on with like interesting things. And, Stoicism might even be able to draw things from more explicitly religious traditions, like, monasticism develops after Stoicism is kind of on the wane, but maybe there's some interesting things to learn from people like John Cassian, or the rule of Saint Benedict, or things like that.
Well, I mean, I'm taking that as a kind of a general argument in favor of expanding your tastes, expanding your philosophical horizons. If you've only kind of dug into Stoicism in the time being, there's other things you can pick and choose. And as you mentioned earlier, you'd be following in Stoic footsteps by doing so, just the way Seneca talked about Epicureanism in his letters, for example. So I mean, I think that ends us on a good note and as a kind of a strong lesson. So Greg, the one thing that I want to give you the chance to do is say, what do you have going on for people that are interested in learning more from you or reading or watching some of your work? Where can they find your stuff? Feel free to share.
So I'm really fortunate in that there aren't a lot of Greg Sadlers out there, and almost all my stuff comes up pretty quickly in Google results. And it sucks for the other Greg Sadlers who are out there, right? There's a photographer, there's a libertarian political candidate, but they're not. If you type in Greg Sadler or Gregory Sadler, I'm the one. My platforms come up the most. So, I've got a YouTube channel. That's probably what I think most people know me for. And I do, for people who are interested in Stoicism, I have a playlist that's just about Stoic philosophy, and it's got over 200 videos in it. I'll plug as well. I have a radio show with a friend of mine called Wisdom for Life, and we do talk about Stoicism occasionally, but we stray into all sorts of other practical topics as well that are informed by philosophy. Writings, people can find me on Medium. For my academic writings, academia.edu or Phil Papers, although I haven't been that consistent in uploading things as I should be, but it's pretty easy to find. And I do have a company, Reason.io, that I started back in the early 2010s, and I do philosophical counseling and tutorials, things like that. And I'll put in a plug too. If people want me to come speak, I do professional speaking. I'll be presenting at this year's Stoicon. My wife, Andy Shaka, and I organized the last 2 years. And so now I get to just sit back and talk rather than MC and organize. And that's kind of nice. So, and that's probably enough. I mean, it's so easy just to like type in Greg Sadler or Gregory Sadler in Google and just see what pops up.
Yeah, at the expense of the other Greg Sadlers. I feel bad for them now, but
Yeah,
somebody's got to win. I've been battling with a saxophone instructor from Ottawa,
Oh, really?
Michael Tremblay, for most of my career. We're pretty neck and neck, so I can empathize with the people, the other Greg Sadlers in this situation. But Greg, it's so great to have you on. Really nice to. I mean, we've been, kind of involved in the Stoicism community for a while, so super nice to talk with you in person. And
Nice.
I learned a lot and appreciated it. So thanks again.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for listening to Stoic Conversations. Please give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and share it with a friend. And if you'd like to get 2 meditations from me on Stoic theory and practice a week, just 2 short emails on whatever I've been thinking about, as well as some of the best resources we found for practicing Stoicism, check out stoaletter.com. It's completely free. You can sign up for it and then unsubscribe at any time as you wish. If you want to dive deeper still, search Stoa in the App Store or Play Store for a complete app with routines, meditations, and lessons designed to help people become more stoic. And I'd also like to thank Michael Levy for graciously letting us use his music. You can find more of his work at ancientlyre.com. And finally, please get in touch with us. Send a message to stoa@stoameditation.com if you ever have any feedback, questions, or recommendations. Until next time.